way in the back, yeah.
Yes.
Feel free to say who you are if you're so inclined.
Yes, well, for our guests here, thank you for coming. I'm partly intern coordinator, partly several other things here at Rutherford. My name is Benjamin Mayo. Thank you very much for an excellent talk. And in your last point about Perriello's getting $1 million from the Democratic Party, how much does President Obama's unprecedented fundraising activity contribute to his influence over Congress?
Tremendously. I don't think, it's not completely new that the leaders of the party, that's the same party as the president in Congress, obey the president. I mean, this has been true for decades as the money in the election system has been dramatically increasing, and of course it is going to increase very dramatically this year. But the Congress was obeying the wishes of Obama and Hillary Clinton and other likely candidates for president before the election, and are of course doing so ever since. When you would ask John Conyers why he wouldn't impeach George W. Bush, after having worked so closely with us in 2005 and us having gone out and elected a bunch of lousy Democrats just so he could chair the Judiciary Committee and impeach George Bush, towards the end he would blame Obama. Obama doesn't want me to do it. And this was when, he was a candidate. But presidents, dictate everything to Congress. It's a reversal of what the Constitution sets up, where the first 60% of the Constitution, the whole of Article 1, is the legislative branch, and the president is supposed to execute their will. Now the president tells Congress what to do, or at least tells his party.
Healthcare is a good example of that. Healthcare is a good example of what you're saying.
Healthcare is a good example. Here you have a situation where many of the Democrats had long supported and campaigned for single-payer health care, a system of health care that almost every other wealthy nation has, and that while it may be hated socialism, costs less than half as much as what we spend and actually covers everybody. And they dropped that at the president's order. The president, unlike the Patriot Act where Bush just says, here's a bill, pass it, damn it, I'm telling you, that the president put on a real pretense of letting Congress do health care, to the point where you had all the Congress members themselves and the commentators complaining that the president wasn't ordering them what to do. But he was very closely directing all the committee chairs exactly what to do each step of the way. And he was holding meetings in the White House with the heads of the pharmaceutical companies, promising them that the government would not be allowed to negotiate drug prices so that we would continue to pay at least twice as much for drugs as other people do. Meeting with the heads of the insurance companies, promising them that nothing would be built that resembled a single-payer system that would interfere with their profits and so forth. And barring the public, just like Dick Cheney, from seeing the names of the visitors on the White House visitors log. Secret meetings. This from a president who campaigned saying that his meetings would be shown on the internet and live streamed and so forth. And then going first to the Senate committee heads and the House committee heads and telling them what's permissible and what the bill should look like and what can and can't be in there, walking them each step of the way along this disastrous path. And then, at least as importantly, going to the heads of all the labor unions and all the activist groups and telling them what's permitted, so that you have labor unions with 90% of their membership supporting single-payer health care, the union itself having supported single-payer health care for decades, holding rallies. Ask Me held a rally in Charlottesville where they told everybody, you cannot say single payer, it can't be on your posters, this is all about the public option, right? Now, if George W. Bush had created something that was not permitted to reach more than 5% of us, probably 3% of us, and called it public anything, all the liberal commentators would have denounced such an absurdity nonstop, day and night. But this was the big Obama public option for 5% of us without being tied to Medicare costs and being run privately, but there's something public about it. And yet, whether you thought that was strategically the best we were going to get this year or not, labor unions of all people know that you don't open your negotiations with the worst thing you'll settle for. You go out demanding what you want, and then if you have to compromise, you compromise. Well, here, everybody pre-compromised, from the activist groups to the more progressive members of Congress, at the instruction of the president. And when Congressman Kucinich brought up an amendment in a House committee to simply put in language to leave states alone, so that states could do single-payer health care if they chose to. The chairman of the committee, George Miller from California, who backed single-payer for years and years, was told by President Obama, kill that amendment. And he tried, but it passed anyway. And it passed with most of the Democrats on the committee voting for it and a lot of the Republicans voting for it. Many probably just because they were going to vote yes on anything George Miller voted no on, just to screw with him. But for whatever reason, it passed. And, some arguing that they were, principled for states' rights, even though they hated health care. Who knows what the real reasons, but it passed. So Barack Obama told Miller and the other committee chairs and Pelosi to just quietly take it out of the bill. So it was when they merged the three bills from the three committees, even though the other two committees' bills didn't interfere with that piece of language in any way, just throw it out. So they did. And on the Senate side and with every step along the way, the president told Congress what to do. And of course, in the media, as with any bill, you never heard you can't find a single article in the newspapers of the past 2 years that refers to Congress's health care bill. It's always Obama's health care bill. With any bill, it's the president's bill. The president is the legislator, which of course misses the whole point of our Constitution. Does that answer a little bit?
Yes.
Thank you. In the third row, and then come here in the first row.
In your book, you mentioned that lies to lead into war are a common thing and have been a common thing for over a century. I actually read that section.
I would say millennia.
Well, I actually read that section carefully because I was a history major and I studied a lot of those things. A number of the incidents you mentioned, the evidence for the lie, so to speak, is scarce at best. For example, the Maine blowing up from the inside. There's very little evidence that actually happened and that it wasn't a Spanish attack. Furthermore, with the Lusitania, there's some evidence that it was carrying weapons, but there's a lot more evidence that it wasn't. On the same note, you have the World War II conspiracy theory, really, that the United States was attempting to provoke Japan into attacking, and then you can say the same for Korea, Vietnam. There's some evidence, certainly, that something like that might have been going on, but there's a lot more evidence on the other side. Now, I don't have the documentation at my fingertips to give you the evidence, but there is that evidence out there. As that is true, and the fact that the evidence that Bush himself, now maybe someone in his administration, I'm not going to argue that they might have been pushing for this, but that Bush himself didn't know for sure that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, that Bush himself intentionally engaged us in what you would call an illegal war, I would call a war of national defense, again, I'm not sure how the documentation comes out on that exactly, but it seems to me, even from what was said, that it doesn't line up that this is Bush's aggressive war. It just doesn't seem like that fits. I mean, how would you?
Well, there's a lot of issues there, which all of which I respectfully disagree on. The strongest evidence on the Maine and the Lusitania is quite recent, so it was not available to the public at the time. But the evidence of the weapons in the Lusitania comes from them having recently found weapons in the Lusitania, and similarly with the Maine. I'll give you my contact info, and if you've got any evidence I might not know of, I would appreciate seeing it. I'm not claiming omniscience, but and I'm also not a history major, but I have read quite a bit about these and World War II as well, and could give you more evidence if you'd like. But on Bush and wars of aggression, there are a lot of points that could be made, and I'll try to be brief and get to more questions. But whether something is an illegal war or not is not a question of your moral preference. It's a question of the law. And the highest law of our land is the Constitution, Article 6 of which says that any treaty we are party to is the supreme law of the land. The UN Charter is a treaty we are party to. The UN Charter says wars of aggression, wars of any sort, are illegal unless they are fought in self-defense. That is, the Iraqis come here and attack the United States and we defend ourselves. Or, for some extraordinary reason, the UN Security Council authorizes a war. When you have a war launched thousands and thousands of miles away against a helpless, unarmed nation by the biggest power in the world, which has for many months engaged in a very public effort to win UN Security Council authorization and failed, then you have sort of the ideal example of a blatant war of aggression. Now you can argue that you think we should have done that war of aggression, and I'll again disagree with you, and we can have that argument. But you can't argue that it was legal, because there's just not the law there. I mean, of course, this was unconstitutional and illegal in hundreds of other ways in terms of our domestic law, but on international law, it's just illegal to go and invade someone else's country. And it has nothing to do with whether the lies were lies or whether they were lies or truths. Iraq could have had all the weapons and more. It doesn't legalize invading them. We, of course, do have all of those weapons and more, and nobody can legally invade us. But in terms of Bush himself not knowing, constitutionally, he is responsible for the executive branch. And you could claim that he was an innocent idiot and didn't know any better, and still be bound to hold him responsible. Nonetheless, the evidence is overwhelming that he knew. Here is someone who met with Tony Blair in his office in the White House and said, "How in the world can we start this war? What's the craziest things I can come up with to try to start this war? What if we painted some airplanes with UN colors and flew them low and tried to get them shot at? Then could we start a war?" And then walked out minutes later to a press conference and told the assembled press corps that he was doing everything for peace, was trying to avoid war at all costs. And when we discovered that there weren't really the weapons, as it was obvious to everyone paying good attention, Bush was interviewed and asked about that and said, "Well, what difference does it really make if he had the weapons? Then he could have been the threat we said he was." This is a president who wanted this war, who was on record for years, even before being elected, as wanting this war. And who really didn't care what the excuse was going to be. And they came up with weapons as something that everyone could agree upon, which I think is just reprehensible.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about the torture memo, and specifically. Sorry, I can understand your argument. It's a pretty good argument as to why the practices in question are unconstitutional. That makes a lot of sense. My question for you, though, is why... What grounds you have for impeachment of the people who wrote the legal memos on it? Like, what did they do that is deserving of impeachment?
Well, first of all, torture is not just unconstitutional; it's even more clearly a statutory crime. During this whole charade,
I was just conceding that there's problems with it. I was just curious about the legal memos in particular.
Well, the case in defense is, we were just providing advice. Our best effort at honest advice on what the law is. Well, these memos, and there's not one torture memo, there are many torture memos, and far worse memos that no one pays any attention to, legalizing things like aggressive war. These memos are so laughably bad. Torture in every instance and every act of complicity in torture, of which this is one, is a felony under U.S. law, under two different statutes, and to draft a memo that tries to get around that because you've been asked to, because the CIA's lawyer and the White House lawyer have told you we want these specific acts to be legal, and you've replied in every instance, yes, that's legal, yes, that's legal, yes, that's legal, and laid out all sorts of mutually contradictory justifications why, including ultimately the assertion that the president can simply do anything because he's the president. That's not good lawyering, and to do it in secret, and to use these as secret laws is another very troubling, constitutionally, a very troubling practice.
So you don't think they were in good faith? If they were in good faith, would they still be an impeachable offense? I mean, you're saying that they were telling them this is what the outcome is going to be. And you fit your analysis around it. So you're saying it was in bad faith, and that's why it should be.
Yes, but I want to make clear that any memos remotely resembling these ones could not have been written in good faith.
I understand.
But Jay Bybee was someone who wanted to be a judge, and who was told, if you sign off on these crimes, if you commit these crimes, if you put your name on that line, we'll make you a judge. And who went to his confirmation hearing and didn't say, oh, by the way, I've created this whole new pile of secret laws that allow us to do these things, and I've done it all in good faith. No, who lied and kept it all secret and became a judge, and who now has a lifetime seat on one of the highest courts in the land, below the Supreme Court, overruling the decisions of honest, decent people. That should not go on.
But I mean, I guess
okay, last follow-up, because there are other hands.
Okay, that's fine. I'm just curious as to when it's a plan of attack, there has to be evidence. Example that in front of an impeachment group that you can say, well, here's the evidence clearly that he wasn't acting that he was acting in bad faith. Is there? You said those things, but are there actually documents on the record that can be presented as evidence that those things are actually said to him that can win in a court of law? Because that's a plan of attack, I guess you're bringing forth. I'm just curious.
I think, and I'm not alone, many legal scholars and even history majors agree overwhelmingly that the memos themselves constitute signed confessions to felonies. They are the evidence. And you look at these memos that pretend to authorize blatant crimes, and with signatures at the bottom that were used as secret laws. Some of them later thrown out by the Bush Justice Department, some of them possibly thrown out by the Obama Justice Department. We now, of course, call the Justice Department by the name of the president, which is another outrage. And that's the evidence. Now, for impeachment, you don't need a statutory offense. You don't need anything proven to any court of law. But for a criminal prosecution, you do. And in fact, under the Convention Against Torture, which is another treaty we are bound by, we are obligated to prosecute any act of complicity in torture. It's not optional. We don't decide whether it would traumatize Fox News executives or not. We have to. And there could not be stronger evidence, short of the videotape of them standing around watching, that acts of complicity in torture have occurred, then authorizations of torture with names at the bottom openly admitted to. So we'll come back if we get through everybody else. Yes, ma'am. And then
would you tell us about your title, why you chose that?
Daybreak.
Daybreak.
It is the translation of a title by Friedrich Nietzsche, which I like. I've been so I may have had it in the back of my head for that reason, but I wanted something optimistic, and of course everyone was in the silly mood that of course I actually critique in the book, that as soon as Bush and Cheney left town, there would be a new dawn of freedom and democracy. But more than half of the book is about what we can do to make things better and what would be a better system, and moving beyond just using the Constitution we've got, improving it and making it a better one. So I thought, I don't know, beyond that, it just struck me as a good one-word title, and then of course I needed a long subtitle to say what the book was about. I think here and then over here.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to ask you about. If you think the expanding imperialistic executive branch is not good, and if he passes on the job to the House of Representatives, they're economically and politically motivated, and they're not doing any good. What can we do? What's the solution? How are we going to fix this?
Well, I did write a book answering that question, but
I didn't get to that.
but the short answer is that there's not one easy, simple solution. Part of the answer, and I hope it doesn't sound evasive, is also that there are lots of useful things we can be doing, and some people are more interested in and better at certain things. There are when the U.S. Army shut down 3 days ago, shut down its killing theme park for kids in a Pennsylvania shopping mall where they had real weapons and video screens where you can kill the Muslims and the terrorists, and for 13-year-olds with Army recruiters roaming around, they shut this thing down, the Army Experience Center, because people had been going constantly and protesting and going to jail and giving the Army more bad press than good press, so it had become a liability. They were getting more negative attention than they were recruiting kids into their killing machine. They shut it down. When activists in school districts go to the school board and say, these tests that are called ASVAB, A-S-V-A-B, ASVAB tests that are given to all these high school kids, and you don't even tell them that it's an aptitude test for military recruiters, and you're going to give all the kids contact info and all their results to the military recruiters, then they're going to get phone calls offering them jobs in the music industry or engineering or whatever they seem to like, but it's actually going to be a job with a gun. You can get those out of the schools, and so counter recruitment is something you can do, even if you think trying to influence our so-called representatives is absolutely hopeless. Educating people is something you can do, and the fact is we're not going to fix anywhere near the majority of what we have to fix while anybody in this room is still alive. We have to educate young people, and there are people who think that we've reached a point where economic influence is more powerful than civic influence as voters and lobbyists, and what we really should be doing is blocking the entrances to the BP stations and organizing everyone not to subsidize BP or whatever corporation we want to go after. And certainly when I worked for Acorn, we shut down major corporations and reformed others. But I don't think it's hopeless to try to influence Congress, and I don't think we can afford to give up on it. And I think as we win little reforms and get more power over Congress, we still have to have the machines in place to try to do it. But I think what we need most desperately is organized activism that's independent of political parties, because most of the groups that will organize you to make phone calls to support this bill and so forth are absolutely loyal to one or the other of the two big parties, which is deadly. And to the extent that some groups, and there are good groups working for peace and justice and other causes that are independent, support those. and support small repairs to the weakest link we've got in our society, which is our communication system. The next peace group that buys a full-page ad in the New York Times opposing a war, should be taken out hunting with Dick Cheney because it's just suicidal. We should be supporting good media outlets, even if they're small, because you support them, you make them bigger. There's a million useful things you can do. But I would say start by going at 12 o'clock today to Tom Perriello's office and his staff people will sit there and write down everything you say and promise to tell him. Do that, and even if you don't want to say anything, be there in the room, and then write about and tell people about what you did and what you got out of it and what you're going to do to try to get some answer out of this guy as to how he's going to vote and why, because it makes a big difference. But there's this big controversy in town that when the right-wingers go protest Perriello, they're shut out of the parking lot and discriminated against, the poor little teabaggers. And when leftists go, oh, well, they're given a red carpet and so forth, which, is actually the result of our protest last month having been completely ignored in the media, so nobody knew about it. The tenants that used to complain about the Tea Party having left the building, so they aren't there to complain anymore. Our protest having been inside the office, not really in the parking lot, and so forth. And if they're, actually, I agree with the Tea Party and think we need to move that office somewhere where you can protest in front of it, and that nobody should be denied that privilege. But the way that the local media will and is interpreting that, it is the way that Perriello's staff will interpret it unless we make something clear. And that is they think that the Tea Party is there to really oppose him and try to unelect him. Whereas we're there to just say, oh, we're really disappointed that you keep putting all our money into the wars, but we'll try to reelect you. Which is nonsense. I will do anything I can to unelect him if he keeps putting all our money into wars, even if it means electing somebody worse, because you can't get much worse at this point. And unless you have some leverage over these people, they can just ignore you. So, what I hope people will be communicating today at 12 o'clock is we're going to oppose you if you keep doing this.
Yeah, I support your urgency about the power being grabbed by the executive branch by unlawful action. But that's how serious and how urgent that is. And I think you made the comment that at some point, if everybody's acquiesced to that, at some point that's no longer illicit. And
it's no longer what?
Illicit. Correct. So, and then in your book you talk about the War Powers Act as one of your arguments. Now, has it not suffered that same fate?
Well, it's a complex issue in that the War Powers Act itself weakens what was in the Constitution to begin with, and gives the president a window of 30 or 60 days to go fight a war. I think the Constitution had it better. The president shouldn't start wars at all without a congressional declaration of war. Once you start a war, it's almost impossible to end it. You have the support the troops nonsense coming out of everybody. I think that the War Powers Act, we'd be better off repealing it, but we'd be even better off revising it and improving it and strengthening it, either through a new piece of legislation or through amending the Constitution. And I think that there are all kinds of reforms that would be very, very useful, and would update the Constitution, given that it was written with the understanding we weren't going to have a standing army. So I think that we should ban wars of aggression. We should ban occupation of foreign soil, which we are occupying over 100 nations with bases. We should require that Congress come back and reauthorize at least every year or 6 months, so that the wars don't just go on forever as they are now. And we should put in place serious penalties for violation. Laws should have consequences. But you're absolutely right that it's completely gone. So you have these commissions that now recommend reducing it to, Congress should play an advisory role, which is, of course, the reality. Congress wants to just play an advisory role. They go and tell the president, you want to escalate the war, you don't, it's up to you, we'll just pick up the tab. That's where we are. And our Constitution, is an ancient document that's way behind the times in many, many ways, but was ahead of us in this, predicted this, knew this, told us, warned us, and got it right, and we've neglected that.